Okay, let's jump into the stack of sources you shared with us for this deep dive. It's all about old world architectural traditions and how they shaped the American built environment.
Yeah, it's a great collection. We've got articles, research, your notes.
It really lays out the story, doesn't it? How building styles from Europe didn't just land here, but actually transformed on American soil.
Right. Completely
So
transformed.
think about so many classic American buildings you see every day. Maybe that sturdy, practical New England salt box house,
Hmm.
or maybe a grand southern mansion with those sweeping columns, or even a city hall that feels, well, like it belongs in ancient Rome or something.
And the roots of those iconic looks actually stretch way back across the Atlantic. It's easy to forget.
It is. And that's precisely our mission for this deep dive. We're going to take your sources and, pull out the essential knowledge, the real nuggets,
Right.
to show you how those European styles, what the sources call the old world traditions, from the perspective of the new world, how they were transmitted here.
How they were adapted to totally new conditions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And ultimately how they were transformed into something distinctly American. We'll try to keep it clear. Just the key insights without the overload.
Yeah, cut through the jargon. And thanks for providing these sources. It really lets us tailor this exploration just for you.
Absolutely. So we'll trace the journey, right, from those earliest colonial settlements where practicality was everything.
Survival, really?
Yeah, survival. Through periods where the young nation consciously used architecture to build its identity.
Then delve into the layers of style in the Victorian era and the grandeur that followed.
Touch on how historical connections kept inspiring later revivals, and then finally kind of wrestle with the challenges and, honestly, the crucial importance of preserving these structures today.
It's quite a story. Survival meets style, tradition meets innovation.
So let's step back. The 1600s, those colonial foundations. You've got settlers arriving from England, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Germany, Sweden.
All bringing their building know-how, their traditions.
But they immediately face a continent that's, well, utterly different from home. New materials everywhere, climates they weren't prepared for at all.
And immediate needs that went way beyond just, putting up a pretty house.
It wasn't just about building, it was about survival
Yeah.
and adapting those familiar traditions to this completely unfamiliar landscape.
Which created what the sources describe as a vernacular filter, a really useful concept. European ideas met American realities.
Like suddenly you have endless timber instead of the stone or brick they might be used to.
Or brutal winters in New England, or incredibly humid summers down south, even the need for defense in some areas.
And that clash didn't just tweak things, did it?
Yeah.
It led to entirely hybrid forms.
Absolutely. Something new was born right there. Out of that necessity, that adaptation, the transformation literally began on day one.
Okay, so take the earliest English efforts. First period English, the sources call it.
Right.
Roughly what? 1626 to 1725.
Yeah, the austere beginnings. Deeply rooted in late medieval English vernacular building. Think southeastern England.
They knew how to build with steep roofs, right? Great for shedding rain off thatch back home.
But here, they quickly adapted them for wooden shingles because wood was everywhere.
And the massive central chimney.
Ah, crucial. Back home, maybe one hearth. But in those New England winters, it became the central heat core for the whole house. Absolute necessity.
You see those asymmetrical facades, too, people built in stages.
Exactly. As families grew or they got more resources, glass was super expensive, so windows were small, those little casements.
And inside you could see the structure, exposed timber framing, those heavy summer beams.
But the American twists are fascinating. Instead of wattle and daub or stone, wood was king. Clapboard, shingles. That became the look.
The salt box form, too, that long, sloping rear roof. Was that for more space?
Seems like it. A direct response maybe to needing more space or shelter out back, perhaps adding a lean-to that got incorporated. The second-story overhangs, the jetties, maybe structural, maybe just a medieval habit.
And those little decorative wooden pendants, pendles?
Yeah, little details, but they're humble signs of those first steps, those adaptations.
They feel incredibly sturdy, don't they? Built to last in a tough place, like the Fairbanks House in Dedham, Massachusetts,
Yeah.
from around 1637.
One of the oldest timber frame houses still standing, amazingly.
Or the Parson Capon House in Topsfield, showing those winter adaptations. The Ross Tavern in Ipswich from 1680. You can almost feel the history.
Okay, moving south. Spanish colonial, a long period, 1565, right up to the 1820s. Iberian traditions meeting very different climates.
Roots in Spain and Mexico, so Renaissance and Baroque influence is creeping in.
Right. Thick walls were key, partly for defense, sure, but mainly for keeping interiors cool in the heat. Limited windows, those wonderful shaded interior courtyards.
And roofs that varied, right? Low-pitched or flat in arid zones, maybe tiled elsewhere.
Exactly. And the mission churches were central, of course, often with bell towers, campanarios, and these ornate entrances designed to welcome, maybe impress potential converts.
But the adaptation here was really driven by local materials, wasn't it?
Hugely. In St. Augustine, Florida, they found coquina, that amazing shellstone you see at the Castillo de San Marcos.
Right.
Tabby, another shell-based concrete, was also used nearby, but out in the Southwest, adobe became the defining material.
Sun-dried earth and straw.
Perfect thermal mass for the desert heat, allowed for flat roofs supported by those visible beams, the vigas.
And that Southwest style shows this incredible fusion, right?
Right.
With indigenous Pueblo building traditions, the rounded corners, the stepped forms.
It's a true cultural blend, which, interestingly, later inspired the Pueblo revival style. The Spanish also brought that town planning model, central plaza, church, government buildings, key homes, all gathered around it.
You can really see the ingenuity, using what the land gave them, shells or clay, and adapting forms to the sun, the climate.
Okay, what about the French? French colonial, roughly 1608 to 1803, left its mark, especially along the Mississippi River Valley.
You see those steep-pitched, hipped roofs, often double-pitched.
And raised main floors, absolutely crucial for dealing with floods, especially down in Louisiana.
But the quintessential American adaptation, I think, particularly in that hot, humid southern climate, has to be the wide porch, the gallery.
Oh, absolutely. It became a fundamental part of the living space. Deep shade, protection from those sudden downpours. It wasn't just tacked on, it was integral.
They also used local cypress wood, right?
Yeah.
Resists rot. Smart.
Very smart. And their timber framing was distinct, too. You had poteaux en terre, posts set right in the ground, not great long-term.
Right, they'd rot.
And the better method, poteaux sur sol, where posts sat on a sill. The spaces between were filled with materials like bousillage, basically mud and moss, or brick, called briquette entre poteaux. It's interesting, the sources suggest this wasn't just practical building, it was a conscious way of maintaining their Frenchness in the New World.
You can still see this, right?
Yeah.
Places like St. Genevieve, Missouri, the Baquette Roubeau House is poteaux en terre, the Jean-Baptiste Valley House poteaux sur sol.
And of course, the French Quarter in New Orleans, the roof forms, the galleries everywhere, that legacy is unmistakable.
Okay, shift north again. Dutch colonial. About 1630 to 1776. Netherlandish forms in New Amsterdam, the Hudson Valley.
And unlike New England's early focus on wood, they used more stone and brick from the get-go.
Early on, steep gable roofs were common.
Yeah, and in New Amsterdam, those two-story gable-end houses facing the street, just like back in the Netherlands. H-frame timber construction, too.
But the form most people picture today as Dutch colonial is that gambrel roof, right? With the flared eaves.
It is, and it's interesting, the sources mention it might have been a later adoption, maybe even influenced by the English, but regardless, it became a really key feature here.
Provided more space upstairs in the attic.
Exactly, more usable space. Plus, you get those charming split Dutch doors.
You can see the enduring influence. Buildings like the Wyckoff House in Brooklyn, parts from 1652, one of NYC's oldest.
Then Cortlandt Manor House up the Hudson, a country residence example. The Bronx House in Coxsackie from 1663, they're still around.
Okay, next up, German colonial. Starting around 1681, settling heavily in Pennsylvania, spreading out from there.
They brought medieval German building traditions with them. Log or stone construction, steep roofs, thick walls, often a central chimney.
And that continental plan, floor layout, kitchen, parlor, chamber, around the central chimney core.
Right. Couche, stube, camber. Half timbering was also in their toolkit from Europe.
And here again, you see really smart adaptations, using local stone or logs extensively, adapting half-timbering techniques.
Building bank houses right into hillsides, possibly Swiss influence there for natural insulation. Some houses were even built over springs for water access.
Clever.
And later, their designs adapted towards the prevailing Georgian symmetry, leading to things like the 4/4 plan or the Pennsylvania German two-door farmhouse. Detached summer kitchens were another practical touch for hot weather cooking.
Examples. The Stone Schifferstadt Architectural Museum in Maryland from 1756.
The Hans Herr House in Pennsylvania, combining log and stone. And the really unique medieval-inspired buildings of the Ephrata Cloister.
Fascinating. And we shouldn't overlook the Swedes, right? Swedish colonial presence, 1638 to 1655 in the Delaware Valley. politically short-lived.
But architecturally huge. Their big contribution was horizontal log construction.
They really introduced and popularized it here.
Exactly. Hewn logs, stacked horizontally, notched corners, clay chinking in between. They used it for everything: houses, barns, churches, forts. The governor's residence was log.
Now, here's the real kicker, isn't it? This Swedish technique basically became the prototype for the log cabin on the American frontier.
It really did. Other settlers, English, Irish, Germans, saw it, adopted it, and ran with it. They adapted details of chimney placement, maybe putting it on the end wall instead of the center.
But the core technique came from the Swedes. Incredible impact from a relatively small group.
Amazing. You can still see rare early examples like the C.A. Nothnagel log house in New Jersey or the Lower Swedish cabin in Pennsylvania from the 1640s. And their masonry churches, like Holy Trinity, Old Swedes, in Delaware, show another side.
Okay, finally, leading up to the Revolution, we hit Georgian architecture, roughly 1700 to 1780. This brought a whole new level of formality, symmetry, Palladian ideals reaching the colonies.
Named after the British Georges, of course. Inspired by the Italian Renaissance, especially Palladio's focus on symmetry, proportion, harmony, and crucially, spread by English architectural pattern books that colonists snapped up.
The defining feature is that strict symmetry, right?
Right.
Balanced facade, often a central hall plan inside.
Typically a two-story box shape. Projects, formality, order. Materials were often brick or wood clapboard painted white to mimic stone.
The entrance was central, emphasized. Maybe a decorative crown, a pediment, pilasters.
Symmetrical multi-pane sash windows, the classic 6/6 or 9/9. Hipped or gabled roofs, dormers adding light upstairs, and classical trim details like dentiled cornices, coins.
And the American adaptations, using local materials again.
Absolutely. Local slate, limestone, different regional bricks, all added character. They adapted the scale, too, from grand southern plantations like Drayton Hall
The classic Palladian example.
to more modest townhouses in the north. And those pattern books were double-edged. They democratized classical design, made it accessible.
But also standardized it to some extent.
Exactly. Examples are everywhere. Independence Hall in Philadelphia, quintessential public building in the style. Hammond Harwood House in Maryland is a beautiful, high-style example. Mount Vernon incorporates many Georgian elements.
It really reflected that growing colonial prosperity, didn't it? And maybe a desire to emulate the British gentry they still look towards.
Looking at all these colonial styles together, the clear takeaway is that European forms were just the starting point. The American environment, the materials, the practical needs of settlers, they forced immediate creative adaptation. It was anything but simple copying.
Right. And then, after the Revolution, the game changes. The young republic has a different goal, forging its own identity. And architecture becomes a key tool for that.
Yes, there was a very conscious decision to connect with classical antiquity, Greece and Rome, linking those architectural forms to the new nation's republican and democratic ideals.
This is also when we see the emergence of what the sources call the first true American architects, right? Professional designers, not just builder craftsmen.
Exactly. A professionalization starts to happen.
So the federal style comes first, sometimes called Adamesque, roughly 1780 to 1830, maybe 40. It feels like the elegant younger sibling to Georgian.
It definitely refined those Georgian principles. Inspiration came from British architects Robert and James Adam, who were looking closely at Roman sites, Pompeii, Herculaneum. It became strongly associated with the early Republic elegance, order, refinement.
It kept the symmetry of Georgian, but lightened everything up, made it more delicate somehow.
Smooth facades, often brick or clapboard. The ornamentation gets focused, often just around the entrance. The real hallmark, the giveaway, is that elliptical or semicircular fanlight above the door, often flanked by slender side lights. Porches are often small, columns slender. Windows are still double-hung sash. Sometimes you see delicate Palladian windows.
But the interior is where Federal really shines, isn't it?
Absolutely. Delicate, refined, classical motifs, swags, garlands, urns, classical figures often executed beautifully in plaster or carved wood. Geometric shapes, ovals, circles, ellipses start appearing in room plans and details.
And the American version was maybe a bit more restrained than the British.
Generally, yes. Characteristic restraint. Architects like Charles Bulfinch in Boston, Samuel McIntyre down in Salem were masters of it. It really symbolized a kind of cultural maturity for the new nation, aligning with Federalist ideals.
You see it in major buildings like Bulfinch's Massachusetts State House.
A landmark.
The Harrison Gray Otis House, also Bulfinch. Alexander Hamilton's home. The Grange. The Davenport House down in Savannah. Beautiful style.
Then, following that, the Greek Revival, roughly 1820 to 1860. And the sources identify this as America's first truly national style.
That's a big claim. What drove it?
A few things. A shift from Roman to Greek precedents, partly fueled by genuine archaeological interests. Stuart and Revitt's Antiquities of Athens was huge. Partly the Romantic movement, including sympathy for Greece's own fight for independence around that time.
But a major part was ideological, wasn't it? America seeing itself as the heir to Athenian democracy.
Definitely. So the architecture literally started emulating Greek temple forms. Prominent porticos with imposing columns, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian supporting pediments became the defining feature.
And applied to everything. Houses, banks, churches, public buildings.
Absolutely. Wide, heavy entablatures, square-headed window and door openings, pointedly not the round arches associated with Rome. Doorways were emphasized with classical surrounds. Ornamentation was restrained using Greek motifs like the anthemion.
And often painted white, right? To mimic marble temples.
Exactly. Pattern books by guys like Menard Lefevre, Asher Benjamin, William Strickland were crucial in spreading this look far and wide. It became hugely popular, especially for grand plantation houses in the South. Regional variations popped up too, like adding galleries in Louisiana.
Key examples. Second Bank of the U.S. in Philadelphia, one of the earliest pure temple-form buildings.
Many U.S. custom houses, Savannah, Charleston, New Bedford. Even Jefferson's Rotunda at UVA, while Palladian in concept, aligns with these classical ideals. Andalusia in Pennsylvania shows how monumental it could look even on a house.
It really captured the optimism of the young nation, didn't it? This belief that America was building the next great civilization, linking itself directly to those perceived purer, more democratic origins in ancient Greece.
It was a powerful statement.
Okay, buckle up. Let's dive into the Victorian era. Roughly 1840 to 1900. This is where things get, well, elaborate.
Yeah, elaborate is a good word. The Industrial Revolution is transforming everything. New materials, mass production, suddenly complex, ornate designs are much more accessible, much cheaper.
So it's not really one style, is it? It's a whole buffet of eclectic revivals. Gothic, Italian Renaissance, French Renaissance.
It's an era of exuberance, complexity, a real romantic departure from that earlier classical restraint.
The picturesque movement is a big influence here, right? Valuing asymmetry, irregularity, a romantic engagement with nature and history.
Completely counter to the earlier symmetry.
And Victorian homes themselves became statements, symbols of wealth, status, sophisticated taste. Interiors got more specialized parlors, libraries reflecting changing social norms around domesticity, privacy.
It's key to remember these revivals weren't just copies. They were imaginative reinterpretations of historical styles for a totally new industrial age.
Okay, first up, Gothic revival. Roughly 1830 through the 1860s, but lingered longer. Medieval Romanticism makes a comeback.
Part of the broader Romantic movement, reacting against the perceived rigidity of classical forms. The vocabulary comes straight from European Gothic cathedrals and castles, pointed arches, spires, strong vertical lines.
Popularized by architects like Richard Upjohn for churches, and through pattern books by Andrew Jackson Downing for homes.
Key features scream vertical. Steep roofs, spires, tall windows usually with pointed arches. And decoration is abundant fancy verge boards along the gables, often called gingerbread.
Right.
Tracery adapted for wood, castellated parapets like castle tops, finials, oriel windows projecting out.
And the key American adaptation is Carpenter Gothic, isn't it?
Absolutely. Because wood was so abundant and affordable here, and the new scroll saw made intricate shapes easy, builders translated complex Gothic stone forms into wood. Board and batten siding was also popular, reinforcing that vertical look.
For bigger, pricier buildings, they still used brick and stone.
Of course. It was a natural fit stylistically for churches' soaring lines, historical associations, and for university campuses, suggesting venerable tradition. For homes, it created that picturesque, almost storybook cottage feel.
Examples.
Yeah.
Lyndhurst in Terrytown, NY, a grand villa by A.J. Davis.
Trinity Church in NYC by Upjohn, a seminal church example. The W.S. Pendleton House in Staten Island shows how it looked in wood. American domestic Gothic is often smaller scale, really leaning into those wood details.
Okay, next, Italianate, about 1840 to 1885. Picturesque villas and those distinctive bracketed cornices.
This was another picturesque alternative to Greek or Gothic revival. Inspiration came from the informal rural villas and farmhouses of the Italian Renaissance, but interpreted through that romantic, picturesque lens. Promoted by figures like Alexander Jackson Davis and Andrew Jackson Downing again.
The absolute giveaway for Italianate is the roof, right?
Totally. Low-pitched or flat, often hipped, with wide overhanging eaves dramatically supported by large decorative brackets or corbels. That's the defining feature. If you see those big brackets, think Italianate.
You also see tall, narrow windows, often arched or curved at the top, maybe with prominent decorative hoods or crowns.
And a cupola or tower, a belvedere or campanile was common on grander examples for looking out over the view.
It could be symmetrical or asymmetrical, but often had a strong sense of verticality, multiple stories. Coins at the corners, balustraded balconies, arcaded porches added to the feel.
American versions often piled on even more ornament than their European counterparts. It was incredibly versatile. You see it on urban townhouses, commercial buildings, standalone residences.
Materials could be stone or wood cleverly scored to look like stone.
And the Industrial Revolution was key again. Those decorative brackets and window hoods could be mass-produced relatively cheaply.
You see it everywhere once you know what to look for. The John Muir Mansion in California.
David Davis Mansion in Illinois, Andrew Lowe House in Savannah, Fort Mason Officers Club in San Francisco. It was hugely popular.
Then there's Second Empire, also called the Mansard style, roughly 1855 to 1890. This is where Parisian grandeur arrived stateside.
Yep, drew inspiration directly from the monumental building projects in Paris under Napoleon III Haussmann's redevelopment, the Louvre expansion. Named after Francois Mansart, the French architect associated with that distinctive roof.
And that roof is the key, the mansard roof.
The defining feature. It's a dual-pitched, hipped roof. The lower slope is steep and usually has dormer windows punched into it.
Creating a usable attic story.
Exactly. You basically get an extra floor within the roofline. Very practical.
It often shares Italianate elements too, doesn't it? Like decorative brackets, paired windows, molded hoods.
Definitely. You'll also often see ornate cast iron crusting along the roof ridges and towers. Square or rectangular towers topped with their own mansard roofs are also common.
It was considered super modern and fashionable at the time.
Hugely. It became the go-to style for public buildings during President Grant's administration, sometimes got nicknamed the General Grant style, favored for luxury homes, commercial blocks, institutions.
Think Philadelphia City Hall.
Massive.
The enormous granite Eisenhower Executive Office building in D.C., formerly State, War, and Navy. Baltimore City Hall. Old City Hall in Boston. They really project that Victorian ambition and prosperity.
Okay, moving to Romanesque revival. This includes the very distinct Richardsonian Romanesque. Roughly 1840 to 1900, think robust masonry, powerful arches.
It looked back to medieval European Romanesque architecture, 10th to 13th centuries, known for its solidity, its weight.
Key features are heavy, massive masonry construction stone or brick and prominent round arches over windows and doors. It gives a real sense of permanence, gravity.
But the American standout is Richardsonian Romanesque, named after the architect H.H. Richardson. He really developed it in the 1870s and 80s.
Yeah, he put his own powerful personal stamp on the style. He loved using rough-faced, squared stonework, ashlar, often combining different colors and textures, polychromy.
His arches are distinctive too, right? Wide, semicircular.
Springing from short, stout columns or massive piers gives an incredible sense of strength. You see round or square towers, often with conical or pyramidal roofs, almost fortress-like.
Windows are often deeply recessed, maybe grouped together.
And sculptural ornament, Celtic, Byzantine, Romanesque patterns is integrated right into the masonry itself, not just applied.
This style felt right for substantial public and institutional buildings, didn't it? Churches, universities, libraries, courthouses, train stations.
Places where you wanted that feeling of gravity, permanence, stability. Richardson's interpretation was incredibly bold and hugely influential.
Notable examples. Richardson's own masterpiece, Trinity Church in Boston.
His Allegheny County Courthouse and Jail in Pittsburgh. The Smithsonian Institution building in D.C., the Castle, is an earlier Romanesque revival example by James Renwick Jr. It just shows how an old world form could be reinterpreted with such power and impact here.
And just quickly, a few other Victorian styles drawing on old world roots. Queen Anne.
Ah, yes, Queen Anne. Roughly 1880 into the early 20th century, visually complex, very eclectic, asymmetrical towers, turrets, wraparound porches, lots of different wall textures, shingles, masonry, half-timbering effects, ornate trim like spindles and brackets. Kind of a catch-all for late Victorian exuberance, drawing loosely on medieval and classical bits.
Stick style.
Stick style, roughly 1860 to 1890, really emphasized the wooden frame visually, use exterior decorative boards, stickwork to outline the structure or create geometric patterns. a reference to medieval English half-timbering, but usually just decorative here, not structural.
In shingle style.
Shingle style, popular for coastal residences, especially in New England, 1880 to 1900. Characterized by continuous wooden shingles wrapping irregular flowing forms. Drew inspiration from American colonial wood traditions, those weathered shingles, but also English vernacular and the emerging arts and crafts movement.
Wow. That era really wasn't just copying history, was it? It was using history as a giant inspiration board to express the energy, the wealth, the complexity of the industrial age.
Absolutely. And that access to machine-made, decorative elements fundamentally changed what was possible, especially for middle-class homes and commercial buildings.
Okay, now as we move into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Victorian extravagance starts to, well, maybe calm down a bit. A new wave of classical order emerges, the age of opulence and order, roughly 1880 to 1930. Dominated by Beaux-Arts and renewed classicism.
Yeah, this was driven by a new generation of American architects, many trained at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. This is an era of monumentality, rigorous classical design principles, and really opulent detailing, sometimes called the American Renaissance.
The nation was growing in wealth, global influence.
And its architecture reflected that ambition. The Beaux-Arts training provided a formal academic system for designing these grand, monumental buildings. This focus on formal composition and planning also directly fueled the City Beautiful movement.
Right, which aimed to bring order, beauty, civic dignity to rapidly expanding, often chaotic American cities.
Exactly. So Beaux-Arts classicism itself, roughly 1890 to 1930, is all about these grandiose compositions.
Named for the school in Paris. Many key American architects trained there. Richard Morris Hunt, the firm of McKim, Mead, and White. Even H.H. Richardson had some training there earlier.
The vocabulary is a sophisticated blend. French neoclassicism, Italian Renaissance, French Baroque influences, all mixed together.
Key characteristics: grand scale, strict symmetry, and just elaborate sculptural ornamentation everywhere.
Imposing facades, often with projecting pavilions or wings to break up the mass. You see colossal, classical columns or pilasters, often paired, running through multiple stories. Grand staircases inside and out, balustrades, arches, vaults, domes.
And the ornament is incredibly rich. Statuary, cartouches, swags, garlands, enriched moldings.
Interiors were just as lavish, dripping with marble, dark polished woods, alabaster terrazzo floors, bronze fixtures, murals, gold leaf, the works.
Planning was axial, right? Creating impressive vistas leading to grand central rooms or halls.
And the materials were typically light-colored stone, like limestone or marble, projecting permanence and dignity. Importantly, these often clad modern steel frames. It was tradition concealing innovation.
The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the famous White City, was a spectacular showcase and huge popularizer of this style, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Hugely influential. It became the default style for major public, institutional, and cultural buildings, museums, libraries, railway stations, universities, government buildings, anything that needed to embody civic pride, achievement, stability.
Iconic examples are easy to find. The Alexander Hamilton U.S. Custom House in NYC.
The main branch of the New York Public Library.
Grand Central Terminal.
Thomas Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress in D.C., San Francisco City Hall. They are absolute monuments to that era's scale and ambition.
Okay, now Renaissance revival overlapped with Beaux-Arts, didn't it? Roughly 1840 to 1925. This looked back specifically to 16th century Italian palazzi and villas.
Right, and the goal here was often a more faithful, maybe more academic adaptation than the earlier picturesque Italian style had attempted. Reflected increased knowledge from travel and study abroad.
Key characteristics: formal, symmetrical facades again, dignity, order, often a distinct treatment for each story, maybe a rusticated, fortress-like ground floor, smoother upper floors.
Arched or pedimented windows and doorways, arcades, maybe as loggias or ground floor openings, elaborate projecting cornices, sometimes roof-lined balustrades, coins emphasizing the corridors.
Construction was typically solid masonry, stone, or brick, reflecting those substantial Italian models.
Suited for public buildings, substantial commercial blocks like banks, and grand urban residences or private clubs. Its formal principles were really absorbed and expanded upon by the broader Beaux-Arts style.
The sources cite examples like the Edward T. Ginno U.S. Courthouse in Maine, the Elbert P. Tuttle U.S. Court of Appeals building in Georgia, and the U.S. Custom House in Savannah. They really showcase that formality, that dignified presence.
And we also see a resurgence of neoclassicism in the early 20th century. Sometimes a bit more monumental, maybe slightly more stripped down or austere than full-blown Beaux-Arts, but sharing those core principles of symmetry and order.
Often replaced earlier Victorian public buildings, right? Trying for a more timeless feel. The defining feature is often that big pedimented portico with colossal columns running through multiple stories on a symmetrical facade.
The emphasis was clearly on authority, stability, timelessness, ideal for government and civic institutions. The U.S. Capitol itself, while built over many periods, really embodies these neoclassical ideals in its overall form.
The U.S. General Services Administration building in D.C. is another example your sources mention.
This style really reinforced the idea that classical forms represented the enduring values of the democratic republic and, well, state authority.
Okay, shifting gears again, let's look at the revival movements that really proliferated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These were conscious echoes of the past, but definitely interpreted for a rapidly changing present.
Yeah, they really reflect the upheaval of industrialization and urbanization, a search for identity, maybe a connection to historical roots in a world that felt like it was changing incredibly fast.
Events like the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, looking back 100 years.
And the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. They were huge popularizers of certain styles. These revivals were often romanticized, selective interpretations of history.
Colonial revival is a prime example. Roughly from the 1880s or 95, booming well into the 1940s, maybe even the 60s, driven by nostalgia and patriotism.
It really picked up steam after that 1876 centennial, a renewed interest in earlier American colonial styles, particularly Georgian and federal. The sources point to a few things. A romanticized view of the colonial past, often seen as simpler, more virtuous, more authentically American, coupled with rising national pride, maybe some anxieties about immigration changing the country.
The restoration of colonial Williamsburg in the 1920s and 30s was huge too, wasn't it? Really captured the public imagination.
Absolutely, and it was also partly a reaction against the perceived foreignness and, frankly, the fussiness of some Victorian styles. People wanted something simpler, cleaner, more American.
So the style borrowed heavily from and reinterpreted those 18th century American forms. Symmetry, just like Georgian and federal.
Central entrances, often with those federal-style fanlights or pediments, maybe pilasters or side lights. Double-hung sash windows, usually multi-pane the classic 6/6 or 8/8.
Materials often brick, frequently painted white, or wood clapboard. You see gambrel roofs popping up, borrowing from the Dutch colonial image. Dormer windows, classical porticos with slender columns. Refined, but generally simpler trim than original Georgian.
Later examples tended to get even simpler, more eclectic in their borrowing.
And while it was used for some public buildings, post offices, libraries, schools, for that association with heritage and tradition.
It became the dominant style for American suburban homes for decades. Really shaped the look of 20th century suburbia. The U.S. Post Office and Courthouse in New Bern, NC, is a public building example cited. It was all about evoking historical continuity, American values, a sense of rootedness.
Okay, then Spanish colonial revival surged in popularity from about 1915 to 1940. A very romanticized take on Spanish heritage.
Yeah, a major catalyst here was the 1915 Panama, California Exposition in San Diego. Architect Bertram Goodhue's buildings there used a highly romanticized, almost theatrical version of Spanish Baroque and Churrigueresque styles.
And it really resonated, didn't it? Especially in regions with an actual Spanish colonial past, California, Florida, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico.
Exactly, it felt appropriate there. Key features, often more picturesque and decorative, more eclectic than the original missions, include stucco exterior walls, usually white or light colors, often textured to catch the light beautifully.
Low-pitched or hipped roofs covered in red clay tiles gives that immediate Mediterranean feel.
Arches and arcades everywhere. Doorways, windows, covered walkways or porches providing shade and rhythm. Decorative wrought iron for grills, railings, balconies. Prominent parapets, sometimes with curves or steps. Tiled towers. Enclosed courtyards or patios.
And lots of colorful decorative tiles used as accents, right? Around doorways or windows. Plaster moldings, too.
It became hugely popular in those states with Spanish heritage felt historically rooted, but also suited the climate really well. Used for everything from small bungalows to grand estates, commercial buildings, churches, schools, even railway stations.
Examples: the Jose V. Toledo Federal Building in Old San Juan, Puerto Rico, the Richard H. Chambers U.S. Court of Appeals in Pasadena, California.
It wasn't accurate history by any means, but it was a powerful romantic evocation of a Spanish past that really shaped the regional identity of places like Southern California and Florida. Still does.
Okay, and we should quickly touch on a few other significant revivals from this period. Tudor Revival.
Tudor Revival, about 1890 to 1940, inspired by medieval English Tudor and Elizabethan styles. Known for steep roofs, prominent gables, often with decorative verge boards, decorative half-timbering, that look of exposed dark wood against light infill, often just applied, tall, narrow windows, often casements with small panes, maybe diamond-shaped, and massive chimneys, sometimes with decorative pots. Very popular for suburban homes, evoking Old English charm.
Late Gothic Revival.
Late Gothic Revival, late 19th and early 20th century. A continuation of Gothic interest, but often more archaeologically informed, more academically correct than the earlier Victorian Gothic Revival. Primarily used for churches and universities, aiming for greater fidelity to historical precedents, often using stone construction and accurate detailing. Think collegiate Gothic campuses.
Mission Revival.
Mission Revival, a bit earlier, roughly 1890 to 1915. Sort of a precursor to the Spanish colonial revival, specifically inspired by the actual forms of the California Spanish Franciscan missions. Generally simpler than Spanish colonial revival, smooth, plain stucco walls, broad, unadorned surfaces, wide overhanging eaves, and those distinctive arched parapets, sometimes curved or bell-shaped. Arcaded walkways too, but relatively simple detailing compared to what came later.
And Pueblo Revival.
Pueblo Revival, starting in the early 20th century and still influential today, particularly in the Southwest, especially New Mexico, takes direct inspiration from indigenous Pueblo adobe dwellings. Massive, earth-colored stucco or adobe walls with soft, rounded corners, flat roofs with projecting log beams called vigas and drain spouts called canales, irregular stepped massing that looks like it grew out of the landscape, and deeply inset windows, often with simple wooden lintels. It's an architecture designed to harmonize with the desert environment, using local forms and materials.
These revival movements really highlight how, even centuries later, American architecture kept finding new ways to engage with, reinterpret, and sort of selectively borrow from old world forms, blending history with contemporary needs and tastes.
Absolutely.
And that really brings us nicely to what the sources describe as the American metamorphosis. The key takeaway, the big idea, isn't that American builders just copied European styles. It's that they profoundly transformed them.
Exactly. That's the core concept. Those European forms arrived and immediately slammed into new environments, different cultures, practical demands that just didn't exist back home. The adaptation wasn't passive. It was an active, creative process of negotiation, of figuring things out.
And that process led directly to the distinct American vernaculars and regional identities we see today. The Old World label is useful for origin, but it almost obscures the sheer amount of American ingenuity and adaptation involved.
Totally. And the interplay between high style, the influences from pattern books and later formally trained architects, and the vernacular, the practical, everyday building by local craftspeople, using what was available, that's crucial to this whole story.
The influence of local materials is a perfect example of this pragmatism, right? Settlers used what was abundant, what was there.
Wood in New England changed everything. Led to timber frame construction, clapboard siding, shingles, a totally different look and feel from European stone or brick traditions. Cypress down in French Louisiana because it resisted rot in the intense humidity.
Brick where clay and kilns were available. And the local variations in clay meant regional differences in color and texture, adding character to styles like Georgian or later Victorian and Revival buildings.
Stone where it could be quarried easily. Pennsylvania fieldstone giving German colonial houses their specific look. Granite in New England. The type of stone available directly influenced building techniques and appearance.
Adobe out in the Southwest. Sun-dried earth and straw. Perfect for the arid climate, great insulation, readily available, easy to work with traditional methods.
And those unique coastal materials like coquina and tabby in Florida and the southeast coast stone made from shells, concrete made from shells and sand, giving buildings a distinctive texture you don't see elsewhere. Material choice fundamentally shaped the aesthetic, the structure, and critically, the regional identity of American architecture.
And climate, just as important. Architectural responses to America's incredibly diverse climates forced equally significant modifications for basic comfort and long-term durability.
In the cold north, especially New England, heating and heat retention were paramount. hence massive central chimneys acting as a heat core, compact plans to minimize heat loss, steep roofs to shed heavy snow, sometimes orienting buildings south for passive solar gain.
Contrast that completely with the hot, humid South. Cooling and ventilation were the name of the game. Spanish colonial in the Southwest used thick adobe walls for thermal mass to keep interiors cool and small windows to limit sun exposure.
French colonial in Louisiana famously put houses up on piers for airflow underneath and flood protection, and incorporated those wide galleries for shade and outdoor living. High ceilings, tall windows, French doors all helped with cross-ventilation. Even later styles like Southern interpretations of Georgian or the later Spanish colonial revival used features like raised foundations, wide porches, central hallways, light stucco, and tile roofs to deal with heat and humidity.
These weren't just stylistic quirks. They were pragmatic, often really ingenious solutions to real environmental challenges, and they led to regionally specific architectural forms that just wouldn't make sense transplanted elsewhere.
And it goes beyond just materials and climate, right? The evolution was also driven by cultural exchange, evolving craftsmanship, and broader societal aspirations.
Cultural hybridization happened constantly. European styles met indigenous practices, like the Spanish fusing with Pueblo traditions in the Southwest, creating something entirely new. Styles blended with traditions brought by other immigrant groups. You see German-American farmhouses developing unique characteristics, or fascinating debates about the origins of things like shotgun houses in New Orleans, possibly blending African, Caribbean, and French influences. A real architectural melting pot.
Craftsmanship evolved too. The skills available to early settlers were different from those of later specialized artisans. New tools, like the scroll saw, literally expanded the possibilities for decoration, enabling things like intricate carpenter Gothic gingerbread. Sometimes a lack of specialized skill might lead to simplification of details.
And architecture became such a powerful vehicle for societal aspirations, expressing wealth, status, civic pride, national identity. The progression we've traced, from basic colonial shelters to grand Georgian plantations, to monumental federal and Greek revival public buildings, opulent Victorian mansions, and imposing Beaux-Arts institutions that mirrors America's social and economic evolution.
So the story isn't just about European styles arriving. It's about adaptation, hybridization, and innovation, creating something distinctly American. That Americanization wasn't just about physical changes to buildings. It was also about cultural perception, taking ownership of these forms and making them part of a new identity.
When you look at those comparative analyses mentioned in the sources, like in Source Table 2, showing the jump from, say, English medieval timber and thatch to the New England wood and shingle salt box.
Or from Spanish stone, tile roofs and courtyards to the adobe walls, Viga-supported flat roofs, and plaza-centric layouts in the Southwest. That transformation is just undeniable.
It really drives home that what emerged here was unique, shaped fundamentally by the American context, the land, the climate, the mix of peoples, the evolving society.
Which brings us right up to today. Why does all this history matter? Why talk about preservation? Because these buildings aren't just old, they are tangible links to America's past.
To its settlement, its complex cultural exchanges, its aspirations, its evolving identity. Preserving them is crucial for understanding that heritage.
They embody the spirit, the struggles, the adaptations of the people who built and lived in them. They reflect that cultural synthesis we talked about, showing how different traditions mixed, adapted, and created new hybrid forms, much like the broader melting pot narrative of the country itself.
And they reflect society over time, don't they? The scale and ornament mirrored social hierarchy, economic changes, collective aspirations. A grand mansion says something different than a simple meeting house. In a young country without ancient ruins like Europe's, these adapted Old World styles became a vital part of the visual landscape and the developing American identity.
But preserving them faces really significant contemporary challenges. It's not easy.
Like what?
Well, first, material decay and availability. Time and weather are relentless. Original materials, old-growth timber, specific types of handmade bricks, certain stones, historic mortar formulas, they decay. And finding authentic or even compatible replacements today can be incredibly difficult and costly.
And the craftsmanship to work with those materials is disappearing too.
Exactly. It's increasingly rare and expensive. Then there's integrating modern systems, HVAC, electrical, plumbing, IT infrastructure. Historic buildings obviously weren't designed for any of this.
Trying to snake wires and ducts through old walls without destroying historic fabric must be a nightmare.
It requires incredibly careful planning, innovative solutions, often compromises, and it adds significantly to the cost.
Life safety, security, and accessibility are huge issues too. Meeting modern building codes for fire safety, emergency egress, structural integrity, especially seismic retrofitting in some areas, security measures, and ADA accessibility.
These often create direct conflicts with preserving historic features, original windows, doors, stairways, narrow corridors, floor plans. Finding the right balance between safety, accessibility, and preserving the historic character is one of the most critical and often contentious parts of preservation work.
And then there are natural disasters and climate change.
A growing, frankly existential threat. Older buildings can be inherently more vulnerable to hurricanes, floods, fires, earthquakes. Rising sea levels and increased storm surge are huge threats for coastal historic districts. Drought and heat increase fire risk, especially for wooden structures.
So adapting these historic structures for resilience may be elevating them, flood-proofing basements, using fire-resistant landscaping. Structural reinforcement is becoming essential.
It is. It's a complex, rapidly evolving field and, again, very expensive. And finally, the overarching challenge is often financial constraints. Preservation and restoration are specialized fields. They require skilled craftspeople and specific materials, and often end up costing more than simply building new. Securing adequate funding, whether public or private, is a constant struggle for most preservation projects.
So given all those challenges, what are the strategies? How do we balance preserving the integrity of these buildings with making them functional and safe for today?
Well, there's a range of preservation approaches. Sometimes the focus is strictly on preservation, maintaining the existing historic fabric as much as possible, carrying out repairs and stabilization using original or compatible materials, maybe replicating missing features based on evidence. Restoration often involves more extensive work, maybe rebuilding deteriorated parts, often integrating modern systems more fully to bring a building back to a usable standard or represent a specific period in its history, while still retaining its core historical significance. Often, projects involve a blend of both approaches. Think of places like Colonial Williamsburg, which involved significant reconstruction, or Independence Hall, which involved recreation alongside preservation, or the ongoing research, interpretation, and meticulous care at sites like Monticello or Mount Vernon.
Adaptive reuse seems incredibly important too. Taking a historic building and giving it a new, contemporary use while keeping its significant features.
It's a vital strategy. Huge benefits. First, sustainability. Reusing existing buildings reduces construction waste, conserves the energy embedded in those original materials, often promotes infill development rather than sprawl. Second, cultural preservation. Giving a building a new economic life ensures its continued presence and relevance in the community.
Makes sense. Keeps the history visible and useful.
Third, economic revitalization. Adaptive reuse projects can bring new businesses, residents, tourism into historic districts, boosting property values. And fourth, it often fosters really innovative design, finding creative ways to juxtapose historic character with modern needs and aesthetics.
We see great examples, right? New York City's High Line, turning an abandoned elevated railway into a hugely popular park.
London's Tate Modern, transforming a massive power station into a world-class art museum. The Brewery Arts Complex in LA, converting old industrial warehouses. The challenges are there, dealing with structural limitations, navigating codes, financing. But the results can be incredibly successful and inspiring.
And the role of organizations and funding is critical to making any of this happen.
Absolutely. The National Park Service plays a huge role managing many key historic sites, maintaining the National Register of Historic Places, which provides recognition and some protection, and administering funding programs like the Historic Preservation Fund, or HPF.
That HPF money is important, isn't it?
It's the primary federal source. Interestingly, it's funded by revenues from offshore oil and gas leases, not general taxes. It provides grants distributed through state and tribal historic preservation offices, SHPOs and THPOs, to local governments and nonprofits.
For what kinds of things?
All sorts, identifying and surveying historic places, nominating them to the National Register, supporting repair and restoration projects, developing educational programs. There are also specific grant programs targeting things like the upcoming semi-quincentennial, or focusing on underrepresented communities, or supporting preservation in rural areas, recognizing that preservation needs to be equitable and tell a fuller story.
And private organizations?
The National Trust for Historic Preservation is the leading private nonprofit advocate. They raise awareness, run campaigns, provide technical assistance, and offer their own grants through various funds, including specialized ones like the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which has been incredibly impactful.
What about incentives for private owners?
The Federal Historic Tax Credit Program is crucial there. It provides significant tax credits for rehabilitating historic, income-producing properties according to specific preservation standards. It's leveraged billions in private investment over the years. Plus, many state and local governments have their own grant programs, tax incentives, or revolving loan funds. Private foundations also play a role. It's a complex funding puzzle.
But all these strategies, resources, and organizations are absolutely vital, aren't they, to ensure that this incredibly layered architectural heritage continues to enrich communities and connect us to the past.
Without them, much more would be lost. And it's important to remember that preservation isn't static. It's not just about freezing buildings in time. There are ongoing critical dialogues happening within the field, particularly around complex concepts like authenticity, interpretation, and decolonization.
Authenticity seems like it would be complicated. What does it even mean for an old building?
It's a surprisingly slippery concept. Is authenticity primarily about the original physical materials, the architect's initial design intent, the intangible spirit of the place? Or does it reside in all the layers of history and change accumulated over time? There's often a tension between valuing the age value, the patina of time, and the need for newness or adaptation to make a building usable.
How do you preserve the social meaning of a place if you have to gut it for a new use?
Exactly. The decisions made about what to preserve, what to restore, what to remove always involve value judgments. And those judgments actively shape the historical narrative we tell through the built environment.
And the sources also discuss the important conversation around decolonizing architectural narratives. What does that involve?
It involves critically examining the role that colonial architecture, in particular, played within structures of power, exploitation, segregation, and the marginalization or outright destruction of indigenous building traditions. Post-colonial theory encourages a reevaluation.
So acknowledging the power imbalances embedded in the buildings themselves.
Yes, and working towards more inclusive, equitable, and sensitive approaches to design, interpretation, and reuse. How do you reuse buildings that were symbols or tools of oppressive systems without inadvertently perpetuating that ideology? It's a tough question.
What are some approaches?
Things like critical reuse, where a building might be intentionally reclaimed and repurposed to tell counter-narratives or serve marginalized communities. Artistic interventions that reinterpret the space. Deep community engagement to find new, shared meanings and ways of interpreting difficult histories embedded in these places. It requires listening and collaboration.
Aesthetic debates and interpretation are also ongoing, right? Tastes change.
Absolutely. Vitruvius's ancient framework of commodity, firmness, and delight, basically, usefulness, structural integrity, and beauty still provides a useful lens. But ideas about beauty, about what styles convey, shift dramatically over time. Preservation constantly grapples with balancing respect for past aesthetics and intentions with the needs, values, and aesthetic expressions of the present.
These dialogues sound essential. They keep the field moving, relevant.
They are. They ensure that the stewardship of America's incredibly layered architectural heritage remains active, thoughtful, relevant, and critically engaged with both history and contemporary society.
So, to wrap up our deep dive then, we've traced this incredible journey of old world styles coming to America, from transplanted necessity and immediate radical adaptation in those early colonial settlements,
Through conscious efforts to use architecture to build a national identity.
into the exuberant eclecticism of the Victorians, the formal grandeur of the Beaux-Arts era.
And finally, to the vital, complex work of conscious historical revival and the ongoing efforts and challenges of preservation today.
The core idea, the thread running through it all, seems to be that American architecture isn't static. It's this continuous dynamic dialogue between imported traditions and relentless local adaptation and innovation.
That American metamorphosis isn't just a historical event. It's the very engine of how American buildings came to be and how they continue to evolve.
And that connects directly back to you, our listener. Now, when you look at the buildings you pass every single day, that federal-style post office downtown, maybe an Italian at Brownstone, those campus buildings that echo European castles, or that colonial revival house in your neighborhood.
Hopefully you have a deeper understanding of where those forms came from, but more importantly, how they were changed here.
They aren't just old buildings, are they? They are physical stories written in timber, brick, stone, stucco. Stories of survival, adaptation, aspiration, cultural blending, technological change.
They hold centuries of history right there in their walls and roofs, embodying the complexities of the American experience.
It really raises an important question to leave you with, doesn't it? How is contemporary American architecture continuing this process? This dialogue between global influences and local conditions, this adaptation. What new metamorphoses are happening around us right now?
And maybe, how will the ongoing debates we just touched on about authenticity, about interpretation, about decolonization, and telling more inclusive stories, how will those shape the future of preserving this incredibly layered, sometimes difficult, but always fascinating architectural past for generations to come?
Definitely something to think about the next time you really look up at a building.